All right. Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad Podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I'm your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. For tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time so early. All right, folks, we are back at it again with another morning episode of Human Frequency, where I bring on my guest host, Krystena Lucastro. Let's get her in here and let's see what we're talking about today. Good morning, Krystena. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How about you, DL?
Very well myself. All right, so let's get into it. Oh, wait a minute. Hold up. We
Yeah,
have an announcement. You have an announcement.
I do have an
What's the
announcement.
scoop?
The scoop is I'm pregnant, y'all. I am about 37 weeks pregnant. So, literally, it's just a matter of when this baby decides to drop. So, this may be one of our last segments or not.
Right?
But just letting you know that if you see that I am just missing, that's why.
All right.
So, but with that, we're going to probably take a little break and then we'll be back at it once I've had my mommy baby time.
Awesome. Awesome. Now, I do want to point out to baby, um, for the next hour and a half, you are not allowed to do anything. Stay there, baby.
I won't move.
So that's that's my words of wisdom to little baby. Uh, uh, do we have a name?
Maybe. We're
Okay.
working on it still. A couple
All right,
weeks
that's
out, and
fair.
we're still like,
I
we're
hear
not
you.
sold. We're gonna get there.
All right.
It's a she, and she will be named.
Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. So
Yeah,
you oh, man, you only have daughters.
only daughters. My poor
Oh, wow.
husband.
Wow.
He did ask the universe to surround him with beautiful women, and I think he
What?
got his wish.
Yeah, yeah. Be careful what you ask for, right?
Right,
So,
exactly.
all right, awesome. All right, so today we're going to talk about the Alex Pretti case up there in Minnesota. So, kind of lead us in on that. What are we talking about? Are we all on ICE's side today? What's up?
Woo. All right. Well, just to frame up what we're trying to talk about, I would say this is not about left or right. It's about what happens when loyalty decides before evidence even enters the room.
Mhm.
So this week's conversation for me with, highlights of Alex Pretti is, bigger than that incident. It's
Right.
more so, just about how, people choose a narrative based off of either loyalty before uh, or why is it escaping me too early in the morning? But loyalty versus justice, and why they don't seem to like to verify things
Right.
before forming an opinion.
Right. Well, now let's set the tone here and let's make sure that we put all the cards on the table and we're we're letting people know where we're coming from and what we understand. So
Yes.
I'm automatically, as a libertarian, I'm automatically, if it's a three-letter agency, I oppose it and I think they should be abolished. Period. End of story. So already I have a bit of a bias for this case. Before we've looked at any details, I've got a bit of a bias. The other thing that I look is like I say, um, there are certain things that I believe you should be permitted to do. Period. End of story. And that I don't want to say viciously, but maybe voraciously defend. So you're even if I don't like what you're doing, so like for instance, I'm not a big like for me, I would not have been out protesting. That is not my thing. I
Mhm.
don't, that's not for me for any number of reasons. So, on one hand, you could say, well, I'm biased against ICE. And on the other hand, you could say I'm biased against people that are out there protesting, in a sense. Where are you coming from?
Loaded question, of course, but I have a similar stance. I'm not out there protesting for, I would say, one big obvious reason right now in my life, but not to say I haven't protested before.
Mhm.
I'm preggers, so I'm not putting myself in that type of danger, especially with how, unfortunately, ICE is very unpredictable, or, for the sake of conversation, they have been very predictable in, endangering people, which is
Mhm.
very disappointing. And that's my take. Um, when it comes to ICE and just how things have been handled, I do try to take my time before formulating any type of opinion.
Mhm.
But, you know, the reality is I'm a Black woman in this country, and, the history behind authoritative groups and, minorities or those who oppose, our government has not been great. So I'm not a fan of ICE. I'm not a fan of what I've found of as far as who they've hired, how they've hired them, their lack of training. So I'm just really disappointed. And then when it comes to the whole conversation around immigration, I'm also very disappointed. And to me, there seems to be an underlying truth of what's really happening in this country,
Mhm.
of removing immigrants from this country. Some of the genuine reasons I don't take issue with as far as criminals. I don't believe they should have equal opportunity, and say and fairness in our country. But as far as the everyday working people who came to this country to escape, you know, torture, exile from their countries or what have you for differing opinions when they wanted to come to a country where they're allowed to have freedom of speech.
Mhm.
I don't agree with removing those individuals who do contribute to our economy, our society, and I'm a proponent of diversity. So to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say they all need to go, to me, is just short-sighted. And like I said, I think there may be some other underlying issues and motives and agendas that's really fueling, all of this.
Gotcha. Okay, so, I'm just gonna make a minor objection. I think at this time, you
Mhm.
probably shouldn't say throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe perhaps not the best choice of words.
Pun
Um,
intended.
but no, seriously, I'm just trying to interject a wee bit of humor into a serious topic.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, and we're gonna get into the, talking about this, but I wanna kind of lay the groundwork because I think what ends up happening, people don't evaluate where they are or put that out in the open so much objectively. So you've kind of laid out and you said, "Hey, ICE not a fan. Law enforcement somewhat not a fan, because of the way they behave and because of, some historical problems that, people like me, meaning you, have
Right.
faced."
Correct.
So, if you were to ask me, DL, is there a situation where you would be supportive of ICE? I'm going to tell you, mostly no. The reason is I don't think that ICE should exist. That's part
Mhm.
of a longer conversation that we don't necessarily need to have here. Now, if you were to ask me, hey, DL, if ICE was going out and it was very visible, even from the protesters' videos, that ICE was really trying to keep the temperature cooler, and I don't mean the temperature in the air, but I mean the temperature of the conflict, the disagreement. If it was very clear that they were trying to keep the temperature cooler, if they were only going after very violent criminals, and they were operating, as best as possible. Now, would it ever be perfect? No. But if it was very clear that they were making that attempt, a valiant attempt to do that, if you were to ask me, Dio, would you then support ICE? I would say no. And again, part of that same broader conversation, I think that should be more of a local thing. Now, would I tolerate them? Perhaps. That's why I say
Mhm.
mostly no. So
Yeah.
now let me throw the question at you. If that were the case, ICE were keeping the temperature cool, they were going after, and every time they nabbed somebody, they showed you, "Hey, here's the victims," or maybe I don't, here's how we know, here's the evidence that we have against them, not just a claim from some official on TV because now we're mad, but actually show us the evidence. And they were bad people, and they were otherwise trying to treat American citizens well, and maybe people that just came across the border. That's, I know this is a long question. If all that were the case, would you support ICE?
Again, loaded question for me because I'm not a fan. Either way, I don't like the way they're going about, handling people. If the handling changed, I would partially be on board with it because to me, what you've laid out kind of honors the Constitution,
Okay.
honors due process. You know, they're actually doing their due diligence to find out if these folks are genuinely here to contribute or, you know, to break laws. And that too is loaded because laws themselves are quite outdated to me
Mhm.
as well. And so, to me, someone who gets a parking ticket versus someone who's a murderer are both labeled criminals.
Mhm.
And I don't agree with that either. The nuance is missing for me. But, you know, I definitely think that there's levels to everything. And if it meets certain criteria, then perhaps. So, yeah, yeah, I think that I would
Okay.
be in support yeah, if they,
Okay. And all I want to do is just kind of get our biases out of the way and
yeah,
out in the open, right? So there is a situation under which you might say, you know what, that is
allowable.
objectively, that is a good thing or at least neutral. And I look at it and I say, nope, I don't think that you should exist in the first place. So therefore, I there's no situation under which I can honestly say I would support this because how can you say those two things, right? So I'm in a
Right.
conflict there. So those are our biases right out the gate. So if anybody's watching and they're like, where do you guys stand? We just told you. Now we're going to talk about the Alex Pretti situation. If we're not going to play the video, I don't think it's necessary to
Mm.
play. It's been played all over social media. What is your biggest takeaway from what you saw of the event itself? Not the conversations about the event, but the event
Okay,
itself.
before we get to the conversations, my biggest takeaway from what I saw was we have untrained authority figures on the streets
Hmm.
mishandling both immigrants as well as American citizens who are peacefully and, you know, constitutionally protesting. This is something that America has, you know, championed for so long, that we do have freedom of speech, freedom to protest, and it seems as though all of that is being dismissed for the plight of a party.
Hmm.
And maybe not necessarily a party, but a plight of an administration who disregards what America, at least what I believe, stands for. And I can't get behind that. And my heart hurts for Alex Pretti losing his life, for, you know, his family, and for the principles and morals and values that he was standing on.
All right. And I'm coming from like the lens for which I look at it. The thing that stood out the most to me, that obviously, that did stand out to me. But the one thing that kind of struck me is a little bit out of the ordinary,
Okay.
that I'm not used to seeing in these kind of events
Yeah.
is when you watch the whole event, you had ICE officers shoving a woman. She fell down. Alex jumps over to her defense, kind of trying to cover her, kind of getting in between the officer and this woman. And I was like, well, yeah, that's objectively a good thing, even if it's an ICE
Okay.
agent, right?
Right.
I want men who are willing to stand up for women, whether you know them or not. And I've said this before on my show. My wife and my son are sometimes out and about. Now they don't go to protest, right? But they're out and about. And if they were to be in a threatening situation and I wasn't present, I would hope that there would be a man who's present that would see a woman and a child and rush to their defense or their aid. So that was one, and that's part of my, the Liberty dad talk, talking about
I was
men
gonna
and
say, I was
you know,
like, "Oh, you're so
so
manly." I'm
right,
like,
I yeah. So for me, that was the first thing that stuck. I was like, oh wow, I was like, this dude literally
stepped up.
laid because a lot of people are framing this, and this is where we can start diving into the conversation. A lot of people
Right.
are framing this like, look who he's defending, and I think it's very misleading because people will say like they'll grab a picture of an immigrant who was captured that probably was guilty of a heinous crime because they'll I'll just make up a name. They'll be like, oh, look at Jose over here that
Mm.
got grabbed by ICE, and like he was accused of rape and murder. Like, oh wow, that sounds pretty bad. And they're like, and then people say that's who Alex is defending, and I was like, but is it? Because for
Right.
starters, Jose in our little made up scenario, because I've looked into a couple of these. They like one guy that somebody chose was caught in New Jersey. And I was
Mm.
like, "Well, he's not in New Jersey. He was in Minnesota." So he's not actually protecting that particular guy, right? And I'm like, so I think it's a little on the misleading side. But what I saw was he directly defended this woman, very
Yes.
clear as day. And I'm like, that. So for me, that's what stuck out. And let's get into that
Yeah.
framing, like left versus right, like loyalty. What are you seeing? What lights your gears, I guess?
Well, what lights my gears is just how impulsive, and quick to judge people are. And it made me want to ask you, like, why do you think people pick sides before they pick facts?
Um, I think we're looking for outcomes
Mhm.
in this particular case, right? Um, I think you have the left, they look like I'm not entirely certain what their outcome is because I think there's multiple factions of the left. So there is this small faction. I have a friend of mine, she has been, sneaking into like far left radical groups, their live streams, she'll go to their events, she reports on it. She'll literally be like, here's a flyer that I got at this event. This is what the flyer says. This is what they want to do. And you have this far left radical component, right? But then you also have what I would consider like your normal left people who just maybe oppose like the way that, police brutality, that kind of a thing. So they oppose the way that law enforcement is going about it. And then I think there's a mixture of people when it comes to immigration, right? So I think it's a little harder to nail down one one size fits all for the left.
Yeah.
The right now, they do seem to have split, but there was this huge component of we need to deport people because all these immigrants are here and they're stealing our jobs. They're taking up all our welfare. They're committing crimes. They're doing all these things. And so I think there was that, like that perspective of they're looking for the outcome of deporting people.
Yeah.
And so
So
I
what
think
I'm
everything
hearing
revolves
here is,
around supporting
yeah,
that narrative.
yeah, because what I'm hearing is, and like I said, I'm not trying to make this a left right conversation. I'm trying to make it like a people conversation.
Right.
Is that people are so quick to judge and are so quick to, make an assumption based off of the filters and lenses that they're looking through.
Mhm.
And right now, it's right and it's left. And they're
Right.
leaving those narratives before they're doing the research or giving time to really ensure that they have quality and accredited
Mhm.
resources and sources to really show them the truth. Because right now, it seems like the truth really is just what you believe. And that to me is dangerous.
Right.
And
And
it's a
and if
tool that a lot of these, institutions and groups are using to manipulate people into choosing a side.
right. And I agree with you. I think it's hard to get away from the right left dynamic,
Yeah,
but I think part of the way that we do that is to recognize that there are some similarities between the two. And so like I said, I think people are looking for a particular outcome and
yeah,
whatever outcome they're looking for, that's kind of how they frame what they see. And I think one of the things that I've noticed on social media is a lot of people will point out and they're like, how is it that we've all seen this same video,
yeah.
which, and everybody's so certain what it means, but there's a division. You've
Yep,
got people that watch it and they're like, he was, they'll say like he was, engaging the officer, incorrectly. He was doing this, he was causing, he's disruptive, blah, blah, blah. And other people are like, all I saw was abuse of police, right? And it's
yeah.
like, but again, I think we're looking at it through the lens of what outcome are we hoping for? And I think that if you want to take it to a higher level away from right
Mhm.
and left, that's where we are. And that seems to be where we are as a
I
society
would
for
agree
anything.
somewhat, but then I'd also say there's a layer of, obviously confirmation bias.
Mhm,
And that although people are looking for a certain outcome, some people, again, and we've spoken about this before, lack the capacity to really be able to digest and discern what they're seeing.
mhm.
And that's why I'm not a fan of the justice system and using eyewitness, testimonies
Right.
and whatnot, because your eyewitness account could be skewed based on the state in which you were in, emotionally, your emotional intelligence. Do you really know what you're looking at?
Mhm.
And so it's just so much more layered than we want to give credit and credence to. And that's why I think it's just so dangerous that people, just because you see something with your own eyes doesn't mean you're seeing the truth,
Mhm.
because it's missing the nuance, because you're missing the background. And when you take something at face value, it just, minimizes the truth of the matter.
Right. Um, Interesting story, that I think kind of highlights this in a less politically charged manner.
Hmm.
Years ago, I lived in Charlotte. I was riding with a friend. We were going somewhere,
Yeah.
and we were behind some cars waiting. And all of a sudden, this car. So we're waiting to cross over a major road, and this car is coming from the opposite direction, and they basically just barge on through. I think they hit a couple cars because they literally didn't stop. They just went on through, and then they kept going, and they swerved. They almost hit my vehicle. I had my hand out my window, holding on to the door so it didn't fall off, and then I had to bring my hand in because I thought I was going to get sideswiped. They narrowly missed me, and then I think they might have crashed or maybe they went on, but I don't remember exactly. But there were several cars there that, had been wrecked into. So we're like, we better stay here because we literally just watched this and the police are going to be here. Let's tell them what we saw. He tells them what he saw. And I was like, and the officer looks at me and I was like, that's not what happened. Like we were sitting within arms of each other. This is
Right.
not a political, thing. So it's not like we were looking at it from political lenses. And yet we came to we had two different descriptions
Yeah.
of what we saw. Right. And I was bewildered because I was like, how did you not see that? like,
Right.
like I,
Like, didn't we experience the same thing?
yeah, and it was so wild. And so I think it actually ends up getting worse once you start adding politics to it, once you start adding anything
100%.
charged.
100%, because when you add identity, and as I always mention, qualia, which to me explains why two people can watch the very same footage, go through the very same experience, but walk away with two very different realities, because belief decides,
Mhm.
what your interpretation is, way before, you guys can see, what's happening. And qualia shapes your perception, and belief is what decides your allegiance. And that's another question I wanted to ask you, like, where does perception end and allegiance begin?
That's an interesting question. Where does perception end and allegiance begin? Maybe they don't.
Mm,
Maybe just as humans, maybe we have the obligation to manage both of those at the same time.
mm,
And I think part of that would mean being open to the idea that, hey, this particular incident, not this specific one, but like an incident might go against my narratives. And I
yeah.
might have to sit and think about it and go, well, okay, that wasn't my first impression, but I can see that. So I think we have to have a willingness to say, not every situation plays into my narrative, which would
Right.
mean for me, I look and I say, ICE, I think law enforcement have problems, but I would have to be willing to say, okay, in this situation, ICE was in the right. They weren't wrong. Not this particular one, but like in a situation, right? I would have to be willing to say that. And if I'm unwilling to acknowledge that perhaps there is a situation where ICE was, or any whatever, but you know, in the right, if I'm unwilling to do that, then perhaps I'm allowing perception, to override anything else.
And I
What do you
would
think?
say, I think people are allowing their allegiances to override their perceptions,
Right.
because too often, people are flip flopping on their morals, their values, their standards, because they want to belong,
Mhm.
or they feel that they need to work really hard to belong
Right.
in whatever group that they say that they stand in. And deep down, I don't think a majority of people think it's right, obviously, that somebody lost their life, but because they're tacking on those allegiances to that lens, it just flips it on its
Right.
head and it changes their perception.
There's an interesting meme that I've come to kind of view with a little bit of skepticism. It's got a single person
Mhm.
and then a crowd, and the person is saying, "Yes, you are all wrong." And I
Mm,
think a lot of people like to believe they are or would be that person, but I
right.
think a lot of people actually end up not being that person.
100%.
And
Like
I
I
think
said, people are so hell bent on belonging
right.
that they'd much rather, be one band, one sound than to stand on their own and be
Yeah.
shunned.
Let's be clear, I think that applies to any group. So
100%.
right, left, MAGA, Antifa, white, black, whatever. And I don't mean every single person in that group. I just think that you will find the majority of people in that group don't want to really be the lone person standing against them. And it could be a group for which you belong in with immutable characteristics or mutable ones, right? So maybe you're a Republican, which you can obviously decide to be something else, right? Maybe you're maybe it's a knitting group. We'll just make up something a little bit less controversial, right? Maybe the knitting group has this view about knitting, and I think a lot of people would prefer to belong than to stand against the group and say, "No, I think that's wrong." Whatever that is, whether it's
Right.
trivial, like a knitting group, or whether it's something more serious, like political activism or something like that. And this is where libertarians, just to throw this in there, we get into a lot of trouble. And the running joke is that we will say, it's almost like you're not a real libertarian unless in the same day you've been called a leftist and a right winger, by different
Right.
people, for your positions. And this happens to
Right.
me all the time.
Yeah.
And even within the libertarian crowd, sometimes, we stand against each other. But a lot
Yeah.
of times I think no matter who you are, there is some group, there is some situation for which you will probably prioritize in group, allegiance over perception. And it's just a matter of degree. What do you think?
I agree. Um, because there's an emotional component to it as
Right.
well.
Mhm.
People want that, like I said, that sense of belonging, and they want to stand strong in the beliefs that they say that they carry, and they don't want to be seen as somebody who wavers, who
Mhm.
flip flops. So, most definitely. But then that brings me to looking things up is
Right.
now treated like betrayal instead of a responsibility, and being okay with standing on the fact that your opinion differs from others, it
Mhm.
differs from the group that you say that you belong to. And why are we so hell-bent on making sure that we fit that mold and that category? So when
Sorry
do
about that.
you think doing your own research became something that people would mock or not support?
So what I see is um I think people generally like the idea of researching stuff. What people end up doing is they still view you have to come to the conclusion of the in group, right? And I think the in group's conclusion tends to be um, kind of defined by what is the in group? What are they about? If you are MAGA and you said, "Hey, I want mass deportations," then you're automatically going to be looking at everything as this needs to support mass deportations. And we can set aside whether or not mass deportations is a good thing or a bad thing. We can just say, is this your position? Yes, it is. Okay. Well, then there's a good chance that you're going to look at everything as, from the lens of this needed to happen. And I think that's why, partially, why a lot of people are leaping to support ICE. And then on the flip side, leaping to support, Antifa or whoever it is that happens to be involved, right? Whether it's, the more raucous protest, or whether it's just an individual that was out there blowing whistles, holding a camera, right? And they're like, "Oh, they weren't doing anything," and the other person's like, "Oh, they were obstructing." And I think again, we're looking at it through the lens of what is my in group, what is my in group about, right?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot we can do about the in group. and we want to be part of an in group. I think that's a very natural and human thing. So it's almost like we're fighting our own tendencies. It's like your
We
right
are.
arm fighting your left arm in a sense. You're trying to do, a little arm wrestling.
And then
'Cause
you brought up something, at the beginning of your statement about people liking to do their own research, and that to me opens up a whole other category that makes this even more complex: AI.
Mhm,
Because some people, they'll look at footage, they'll look at videos and not check to see the authenticity of it. And
mhm.
again, take it at face value. So that muddies the waters even further. You're looking with your own eyes, yes, but is what you're seeing real?
Right.
And that's what's, like I said, muddying the waters of the conversation and your beliefs and who you're supporting. So
Right.
what do you say about that, about AI and how that's changed the conversation
So I
and
think we have to
and
be very
services?
careful
Yeah.
with the information for a number of reasons, not just AI. So sometimes I've seen situations where people will grab a they'll get a screenshot, like just a single image, and that'll float around, and they'll be like, "Oh, this happened." But then you watch the video, and you're like, "Oh, well, that's out of context." You
Mm,
know, it's almost like if I said, a profanity, and then people are like, "Oh, he's insulting a group." Like, let's say I use a slur, I just say any slur, and then somebody might go, "Oh, I can't believe he's insulting people like that." But then you might pan back and say, "Oh, wait a minute. He was actually quoting somebody else and criticizing them." Right? So there's a situation where you're getting stuff out of context. And then I think there was a screen grab in this particular case that was going around that appeared like the officer was holding the firearm toward right at the back of Alex.
I saw that
And
one too.
I think somebody tried to clean it up a little bit with AI,
Yeah.
and it ended up being a nice cleaner image. But there was one I saw where one of the ICE agents had no head.
I saw
AI
the same
removed the
one.
head. And so then, so it was like, and that was more of the left, like, the people that were opposing ICE. And so that was the image that got passed around from them. And I didn't really see any AI generated images other than that or video of this particular incident
Right.
necessarily. But there were some 3D graphics that were generated of, like, say, the previous one, Renee Good, where they were trying to show the proximity of Agent Ross to the car. And the problem with that is the angle for which they were showing it was the angle that we might want to see, but it was not an angle that we actually had. And
Correct.
there were so, people might have to sacrifice a little bit on the details in order to give you an image to look at for perspective. But if you don't realize, hey, there may be a sacrifice of the details here, then you might be willing to accept that as truth and fact. And so I think we have to be very, very careful with all of this. I've seen videos. Have you seen any other AI videos of this event?
I actually have tried to do my darndest not to watch too many videos because of that fear
Hmm.
of being shown something that isn't genuine. But, I'm on social media and stuff pops up all the time. So I've seen more images than anything. One image that I have seen is Mr. Alex Pretti holding his cell phone, and then the very same image, but instead of a cell phone, it's a firearm. So,
Oh,
yeah.
I did not see that. That's interesting.
Yes. So with that, do you think AI exposes our weakness or has it created new ones?
Um, I don't.
Or better yet, do you think that the dangerous technology or our readiness to believe?
Here, I think we're still in a um I think we're still in a position where we're not going to get too easily bamboozled, because one of the things that I've noticed is that when AI comes out of something, people are very quick to point out how it's AI. Sometimes too quick. Like, I've seen video that ends up being actually real footage of something, and people called it AI. And they like tried to zoom in. They're like, "Oh, it looks like there's only like
Oh,
three
I feel
fingers
like
or
you
something
give
like that."
people too much credit.
So I think there is a culture of questioning video and footage. Um, I don't think it's as robust as we would like it to be, but I think it is out there. And so I think we're still in a reasonable area where, not that we can trust everything that we see, you should always be skeptical, but I think if something comes out that is inaccurate, that is made up, intentional, or just because AI didn't do a good job, I think we still have this place where we're critical and say, no, that's not, and it kind of gets that travels around fairly quickly.
And
Um,
that's, I feel like, a part of the problem. I know you're saying, we need to use our discernment and be skeptical, but again, and like I said, I feel like you're giving people too much credit. Not all people, but
mhm,
unfortunately, a very large group of people in this atmosphere, in this environment politically, where they just, again, are going off of the narrative of their team.
mhm,
And to me, it's like, what happens when persuasion outpaces discernment?
right. And I will say this. Now, I know you're saying like, "Oh, you give people too much credit." I'm only all I'm really trying to say is that I think that there is still a hefty amount of effort that people will put into saying, "Is this real?" Now, the
Yes.
problem with that, the counter side to the other side to that coin, is that sometimes the information will get out, and like, let's say an account has a lot of followers, they post a video or an image that is not accurate, a lot of people like it, like 10,000 likes or something like that, and then the information comes out and says, oh yeah, here's where that image was totally made up or whatever, or there's some additional context. That information itself does not necessarily get the same level of travel
Yeah.
as the original information. But I think that goes for both sides. So if you've got something that come out that's true, and then there's negative information, counter, misinformation about it, that doesn't travel as fast as the original did. So
Yeah.
it kind of is a race to get the right information out, because the first one gets the most attention, subsequent
Agreed.
ones get less attention, and it just matters is what matters is, okay, did the first one, was that did that happen to be correct?
Right.
Um, and that's especially bad for events as they're unfolding. It's like, oh, there's a bank robbery, and like 3 people have been killed, and then everybody's like, "Oh man, there's 3 people killed." And then we find out there's like 1 person that was killed,
Right. And then
which is a tragedy.
that also makes me think too, and sorry to cut you off, but the first to say something is the most important. But
Right.
what's really dangerous, in my opinion, is where it's coming from.
Mhm.
And it has to do with that hierarchy and that dominance. And when you have people from the White House, already out of the gate without any investigation, picking a side, drawing a
Mhm.
conclusion, and making a statement, that then plays into the, oh, well, I have to believe this because it's coming from the highest authority.
Right.
I have to be on that side because that's my team. And they
Right.
wouldn't say that unless there was some truth to it. And so that's why it's like truth gets skewed so often, because people really do hold merit in who it's coming from, where it's coming from.
Yes.
And that, to me, funny enough, Ted Cruz was one of the, folks who spoke out against the White House coming out so quickly and saying that they needed to kind of, pump their brakes and take a pause before they make any statements, to make sure that there are proper investigations, and
Mhm.
to not, be so quick to make these type of statements, because people are so eager to believe their government.
Right. Well, and don't pitchfork me just yet. I think it'll make sense once I get it all out. I think there's a difference between the White House and other
Hmm.
people. And I think
Yeah.
other people are coming from, what is the outcome that I'm looking for? Like I said earlier, what does my team believe? I think the White House, and this goes for any administration, so it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, I think the White House has a narrative that they explicitly want to sell. And I think this
One.
explains why the
Yeah.
White House immediately came out and they're like, he's a domestic terrorist. And I was like, based on what? Like,
Right.
domestic terrorist? Like, you just calling everybody a domestic terrorist. Like, that seems crazy. Um, and so I think they were trying to drive a narrative, whereas
100%.
the general public, they can just be earnestly wrong because they don't realize that they're engaging in team sports, right? And some of them also are going to
And that's
be
what's
wrong on
dangerous.
purpose too.
Yeah, that's what's dangerous, I feel like, with the White House, because the White House is supposed to be neutral, is supposed to, show some diplomacy,
Mhm.
some,
Right.
if not the most. and that's just not happening, and people don't see that as an issue.
Right.
That they're so quick to say he's a domestic terrorist instead of saying we don't have all the facts. You know, this was a very violent situation that involved some individuals, like staying neutral before making any, broad statements like that. And that to me
Right.
shows that our administration has been compromised and that they do have an agenda to frame what's going on in their favor in order
Right.
to rile up their base, their team, and that to me is disgusting, honestly.
Yeah, one of my friends, I'm gonna read him here. I'm not gonna tell you who it is, just as a courtesy, but I'm gonna read something he posted, and I thought this was very insightful.
Okay.
He said, "One of the many wild things about these ICE incidents, all the Republicans had to do was say, 'Yeah, this looks like it might be a bad shot in an unnecessary situation. Let's do a full investigation to make sure everything was done properly, recommend adjustments to training, and ensure our officers uphold the highest standards. We can't let unprofessional conduct jeopardize our mission to keep America safe.' That would have nipped over 50% of dissent in the bud, even if they then later did nothing and buried it, and then could have sacrificed a few pawns to stay on the board without issue." And to your point about, I don't think our government's ever going to come out being neutral because they always have an agenda. They're trying to accomplish certain things, right? And they have an incentive. The administration is the one that's sending out these ICE agents, so they have an incentive to be on the right side of every incident. Um, but I think my friend is correct in saying, hey, they could have played this, you know, to their side and still tried to pretend to be objective and then basically even let it go under the bridge later. Just like, "Yep, we're gonna look into this. We'll let you know," and then not let us know. And then probably people would have been like, "Oh, okay, they're being objective," right? When all the so it's very interesting because they went out of their way to take the extreme position and say, "Oh, he's a domestic terrorist. He was doing all these things," and then now we're seeing articles come out like, "Oh, did you know that Alex had a run-in with ICE agent or some agents, like a week prior or whatever, and he's got broken ribs and whatever." And then there was some fake stories that I think came out. Some people were passing around that his parents were concerned about him being in this organization that he was in and warned him not to go. And then people were latching onto that. And then on Twitter, they have community notes, and the community notes were like, "Yeah, his parents actually didn't say that. There's no record of this."
Right.
So it's just very interesting. What's going on out here because there's like so much information, and I think it's just like you said, it's a race to be the first. And I will say this, and I have said this, a lot of people point out that you have a lot of citizen journalists, which I'm cool with. I think it's a good thing. But I think we have fallen to this belief that the citizen journalist, the new alternative media,
Mm.
is more accurate than the
Yeah.
mainstream media.
Yeah.
And I'm looking and I'm like, no, actually, both of you suck.
Right.
Right, both of you are bad because there's one citizen journalist that I follow, and she has made repeated mistakes, big ones for a journalist.
But does she own them?
So what she tries to do is she'll make a mistake and then she'll be like, "Well, I deleted my tweet, and now I got that wrong." But again, it's the same situation. The first information gets all the traction.
If
The
it bleeds, it
second,
leads.
right, and the
Journalism
second,
101.
then
Right.
it's like when you see a New York Times article, and then you read it, and then later they offer a correction at the bottom. They're like, "Oh, there's a correction." Now, normally the corrections are a little on the minor side. "Oh, we said it was June 15th that this thing happened, but it was actually June, 17th or something." That in that particular case, that's not a big deal. Like it's good to be accurate and, more robust. That's not a detail that generally is going to be critical to the whole story.
Right.
But sometimes it is. And even when it is, that information just basically gets a little bit of a mention, a brief
Gets kind of
mention, you move on.
minimized.
Right.
Right.
And so I think the alternative media is just as bad, can be just as bad as the mainstream media, and they have just as loud of a voice,
Hmm.
perhaps louder, depending on whether or not you're on the older side and maybe you just simply watch CNN and whatever else on TV, Fox News, whatever, or if you're on the younger side and you're like, I'm going to get my information from whatever internet alternative media source that I prefer. Right. you know, in that case, I don't think
And
it's right and left. It's just
there's definitely an oversaturation of sources out there that I don't even know if you can call them sources, but that
yeah,
definitely makes it more difficult to get to the truth.
right. And that's why on this show, when I am talking about something, I try to get the basic facts of the matter correct
Right.
and then allow for dispute of my interpretation of what that means.
I like
So
that.
if I say like, "Hey, this guy," like I've seen cases where we don't know who the person is in the story, and then people have uncovered who they are, and they've uncovered the wrong person,
Mm,
right? So
yes.
I never, and that's a tough part with journalism, right? Like you do want to get the story first. And if you're the last one to get to the story, you're probably not going to get much attention. So I could understand the dynamic there. But I think there used to be a saying, we would we prefer to be right than first, you know, because that's you your reputation is as good as your accuracy,
Mhm.
you know, and that's kind of how I look at it. So we've talked about AI, we've talked about this, this dynamic of loyalty. Um, where does emotional intelligence and empathy come into this situation? And before you
Emotion
answer, let me throw a curveball at you.
Okay, oh god.
I want you to think of it in two contexts.
Okay.
Alex, who obviously was killed and was in a violent confrontation before his killing, but
Mhm,
then also the ICE agents who are indeed going out into hostile situations, and they don't know if this, and I hate to use the line, but they don't know if this is going to be the protest where somebody throws a Molotov cocktail at them, right?
mhm,
And that could happen, right?
mhm.
Right. The left has shown that there are elements within the left who are willing to be violent. So talk about empathy and emotional intelligence from both contexts.
Whew.
Yeah.
Alright, that's a lot to chew on. EQ, empathy. Ultimately, at the end of the day, people are just not seeing each other's humanity
Mhm.
as a whole. And that is where we're losing on both sides and all sides, really. Because, on Alex's end, he feels as though he is fighting a fight to protect his fellow Americans, and so do ICE.
Mhm.
The narrative is kind of the same on both sides, but it really does matter what filter you're looking through. It matters what your identity is. From the side of the ICE agents, from what I found, they do hold some extreme views, and they don't mind stepping out there, knowing that there could be high risk of violence and even death.
Mhm.
And sadly, the same kind of goes for the protesters. So the mission seems to be the same on both sides, but it's the reasons
Mhm.
for that mission, and where they stand as far as those principles, those values, and their morals. So that's the craziest part about all of this. I feel like too often at the root of it, we're all fighting for the same thing,
Mhm.
to belong, to feel safe, and the way we're going about it is just it's not it.
Right.
So that's the
So,
best way I could put it for right now.
okay, okay. All right. So, what if
Mhm.
what if the answer to that, and if the question is, how do we how do we keep proper levels of empathy for all sides? Because
The best way
I'm
to keep proper empathy for both sides is to practice pause.
Mhm.
Too many people are quick to judge, quick to believe,
Mhm.
quick to act. And, like I said earlier, as far as my take on what actually happened with Mr. Pretti, I do feel like because of the ICE agents' lack of training, it was a bad shot, to your
Mhm.
friend's point. They didn't take the time to pause and to really assess the situation. And unfortunately, someone lost their lives. And these are not things that we should play with. We should, take the time to make sure that any group is properly trained, especially those who have authority, quote unquote. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's on the protesters to be properly trained on how to handle ill trained authority figures. But it
Mhm.
seems as though that's the route we have to go, just like, you know, in schools having to prepare children for unfortunate, you know, reality of a possible shooting. You know, we have to be prepared on all sides, and too many
Mhm.
people go in naive, they go in ill prepared, and it just makes the situations much more heightened than they need to be.
Mhm.
And it gives us outcomes like this where there's loss of life. And it's
Right.
extremely unfortunate. And I think, you know, we kind of spoke to this before, that there just seems to be this script that when mistakes happen, instead of owning it,
Mhm.
often people want to find justification
Right.
for why it happened, and so that they can feel okay with it. They
Mhm.
can feel right. They don't have to feel the pain of that loss. And like I said, ultimately, I feel like people are failing one another in their humanity of just not pausing, not seeing a person for being a person, an individual, and trying to clump them in or frame them in a way that makes them feel better about the horrific act.
Right. What if also we said, hey, one way to improve as a society how we approach these kind of situations? What if one way is to say, we absolutely have to recognize that um, higher level than ICE versus immigrants, ICE versus left wing, protesters, activists, whatever you want to call them, agitators, higher than that, humans. Because I no more want to see a protester lose their life than I do an ICE agent.
Right.
And it doesn't matter who's in the wrong. I don't now there may be a situation where I justify one or the other and say, hey, I think this is justified,
Mhm.
right? So for example, like if you go way, way back, the easiest example that comes to my mind when it comes to law enforcement, um, the Breonna Taylor case. So
Mhm.
the police, they claimed that they announced themselves before they barged into the house. Neighbors disputed that, and ultimately, the boyfriend, who immediately turned around and started shooting and ended up shooting one of the officers, he was acquitted, right? Because they said, "Hey, you know what? Like he didn't know who you were." And so there are situations where I would say, "Hey, it is justified that a person, shoots a law enforcement officer." There are also situations where it's justified that a law enforcement officer shoots a citizen or maybe even an immigrant, right? But at the end of the day, I try to look at it and say, these are human beings,
Mhm.
whichever side that they're on. And the to me, I first look at it and say, even if I think it's justified, I still am always going to remain. It's sad. It's very, and I don't hate to use the word unfortunate because it sounds like it's downplaying it, but it's a human loss of human life is a tragedy, right? Whether you die of old age, that's obviously a thing and it happens and death comes for us all in one way or another. But so I look at it and say it's always because the one thing we all share, no matter what side we're on, death and taxes, but mostly death.
Right.
So, we all share that. We all are going to die. And so I think that's one of the things that we can use to kind of bind ourselves together and say, hey, this is the shared experience that we're all going to have. And so maybe we treat it with a little bit of decorum, first and foremost. What do you think? Does that sound
I
reasonable?
agree. It is reasonable. And man, I know we could talk about this forever, and we're kind of wrapping up.
Oh yeah.
And that
Time
kind of,
flies.
you know, that takes me to our takeaways of, you know, justice requires patience. It requires patience, and loyalty demands speed. And that is not, you know, something that we should take lightly. Only one of those leads to truth. That is what I would say as a takeaway. And I do have some questions for the audience before we, you know, go on with our day. Now, what do I believe without checking?
Mhm.
And do I equate confidence with truth? What feeling am I avoiding by choosing certainty? And what taught me which voices matter? So those are some of the questions I want to leave the audience with, leave us both with, because these questions aren't just for y'all, they're for us too.
Right.
So, and again, my heart bleeds for Mr. Pretti, his family. I'm disappointed in how that was all handled. And I truly hope that our country can start waking up to realize that this is not how we need to be going about handling each other.
Good. Good words. We are not going to do the typical closing today. Instead, I want to play a quick video. It's about 40 seconds long. I'm going to take Krystena and I off the air. We'll play this video and then we'll end the show. So thank you, Krystena, for joining me
Thank you.
this morning. And I will take us off the air and then we will play this video. And then that'll be the end of today's broadcast. I will see you guys tomorrow.
This moment, we remember and give thanks. Today we remember that freedom is not free. We have to work at it, nurture it, protect it, and even sacrifice for it. May we never forget and always remember our brothers and sisters who have served so that we may enjoy the gift of freedom. So in this moment, we remember and give thanks for their dedication and selfless service to our nation in the cause of our freedom. In this solemn hour, we render them our honor and our gratitude. You guys can follow.